Thank you very much. Let me, first of all, recognize the President of the Senate, Honourable Humphreys, also Honourable Peter David, Honourable Nazim Burke, my dear Minister, nice to have you, the President of the GRAMFO, Mr. Ferguson, and the other executive members, and to all of you, the wonderful people of Grenada, Carriacou and Petite Martinique. Price wouldn't forget me if I mention Carriacou and Petite Martinique. But I want to thank you for inviting me. As a matter of fact, I will say that Grenada is my second favorite country in CARICOM. So it's always a pleasure to be here. And but let me say from the start that I consider it a privilege and an honor to be invited to deliver the inaugural March 13th lecture to commemorate the groundbreaking revolution that began in Grenada on March 13th, 1979. I therefore commend the Grenada Revolution Memorial Foundation, and by extension, the government and people of Grenada, for keeping alive the memory of that historic occasion. I do so for several reasons. First, both philosophers like George Santayana and practical political leaders such as Winston Churchill have repeatedly told us that, and I quote, "Those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it," end of quote. However, the problem is that history is constantly being redefined by the quote-unquote winners in such a way as to present the quote-unquote losers as having made an insignificant contribution to the evolutionary process of human development. So whether we like it or not, the history of the world is written from the perspective of those who have succeeded in establishing the hegemony over others, defined as different, based on tribe, race, color, ethnicity, class, nationality, or ideology. But because human beings have the capacity to reason and to reach their own conclusions about what is right or wrong, there has always been considerable resistance to domination and an almost unquenchable thirst for freedom. I am convinced that this unending struggle for a better life by the oppressed has led to a culture of resistance and a progression towards a higher form of civilization. It is therefore absolutely imperative that enlightened states and social institutions provide opportunities for people to express their different perspectives on history as a democratic right. The history of the Caribbean, that collection of countries that are washed by the Caribbean Sea and which includes parts of Central, North, and South America, offers considerable evidence to support this thesis. Those who are familiar with the history, with the people's history of the region, would know that it has been the confluence of cultures from nearly every continent ever since Christopher Columbus accidentally landed in the region in 1492. Since then, it has been the victim of European hegemony of one sort or another that systematically destroyed or suppressed the indigenous civilizations, as well as the cultures of people brought in from as far as Africa and Asia. But despite this, the reality is that the Caribbean has established a long tradition of resistance to genocide, slavery, colonialism, and racism. As a result, the region is famous for its independent thinkers and political leaders who spoke out and struck blows for freedom and self-determination. They envisaged our destiny as independent shapers of hemispheric unity and progress, rather than appendages of empire. They, in one way or another, contributed to the emerging Caribbean civilization. These leaders range from Nani the Maroon to Toussaint Louverture, from Bolivar to Marty, from C.L.R. James to Franz Fanon, and from Marcus Garvey, Clement Payne, and other leaders of the civil disturbances of the 1930s, to the succession of outstanding political leaders who took the countries to independence from the 1960s. The Caribbean, like the rest of the world, received a powerful ideological injection from October 1917, when the Russian Revolution, fueled by the Communist Manifesto, succeeded in toppling one of the most powerful empires in existence. By stressing the nobility of work and advocating ownership and control of the means of production by workers for workers, this manifesto and the related revolution succeeded in sending a powerful message of hope to oppressed workers throughout the world. They even promised to, and I quote, "Everywhere, support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things," end of quote. And because this revolution was perceived as posing a threat to the dominant capitalist states of the world, it ushered in the Cold War. Most of the 20th century was therefore characterized by a struggle of workers to unite and seize control of states in order to improve the conditions under which they worked. This struggle lasted until the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. Between October 1917 and November 1989, the international landscape experienced the most polarized configuration of foreign policy and developmental options. Global power was split between capitalist and socialist models. Even the attempt by several developing countries to define themselves as an autonomous third world ran into problems. So intense was the global contestation between the two monolithic ideological and economic systems that even the attempt to create a non-aligned movement was racked by internal tensions from the Cold War. The Cold War undermined the freedom and independence of sovereign states by forcing them to submit to the supremacy of either the capitalist or communist group. Needless to say, the Communist Manifesto had a powerful appeal to countries of the Caribbean region. Its ideology contained apparent solutions to all forms of oppression, particularly those based on class and race. As such, it built a momentum that reached a climax in the Grenadian Revolution of March 13, 1979. The significance of the Grenadian Revolution, my dear friends, is that it elicited a massive response from the most powerful capitalist state in the world, simply because it was seen as tantamount to throwing a match to a keg of gunpowder. If the revolution had succeeded in the backyard of the USA, it was feared that it would have led to the demise of the capitalist Goliath among non-white nations, weakened by racist and capitalist exploitation. Throughout the crisis, Maurice Bishop offered a completely different perspective to that of the US government. And this is what Maurice Bishop had to say, and I quote, "We are obviously no threat to America, nor is Cuba for that matter. I think Washington fears that we could set an example for the rest of the region if our revolution succeeds. In the Caribbean region, you're talking about small countries with small populations and limited resources. Countries that over the years have been classic examples of neo-capitalist dependencies. Now you have these new governments like Nicaragua and Grenada that are attempting a different experiment. They are no longer looking at development as how many hotels you have on the beach, but in terms of what benefits people get. How many have jobs? How many are being fed, housed, or unclothed? How many of the children receive education?" Maurice continued to say, "We certainly believe in Grenada that the people of the English-speaking Caribbean want to see an experiment like that succeed. They want to see what we are trying to build come about. America understands that, and obviously, if we're able to succeed where previous governments following different models failed, that would be very, very subversive," end of quote. Despite the pleas from Maurice Bishop, the USA mobilized enough military force to subdue a nation state several times larger and more powerful than Grenada in 1983. The revolution was ruthlessly crushed by the United States. The impact of this aggression was to intimidate potential socialist revolutionaries wanting to improve the lives of ordinary people. History will therefore one day show that the end of the Cold War began in 1983 with the invasion of Grenada and not 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. So Grenada, you are in international history. Between the 2 Octobers of 1917 and 1983, the Caribbean itself experienced several tensions. In many respects, the options were set for the region by the Monroe Doctrine, which sought to establish the Americas, including the Caribbean, as a sphere of uncontested influence of the United States. And even though many Caribbean nations fell in line with that prescription of power, a few defied it. From that 1st October of 1917, insurrections influenced by the example of the Russian Revolution occurred in most parts of the world. However, in the English-speaking Caribbean, it was not until 1953, with the assumption of power by Cheddi Jagan under colonially administered elections, that the first real rejection of a Caribbean state with the neo-colonial development model was first attempted. Of course, as we know, the British colonialists would have had nothing of it, and military intervention in this democratic outcome reversed the people's will. The next major historical milestone that challenged the hegemony of the West in the Caribbean was the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. That history is well known to all of us. And 50 years later, with the declassification of secret documents, we have learned of the innumerable efforts at subversion of that revolutionary process. The lesson that these documents convincingly teach is that in every historical context, any intervention aimed at stifling the people's aspirations for liberation from oppressive regimes inevitably leads to a deeper radicalization of the process. Following the Cuban process, the Michael Manley experiment with democratic socialism and the experience of Allende's Chile were the next major efforts to make a break with the old structure of dominance and dependence. In both of these cases, interventions of destabilization by capitalist agents led to the demise of the radical project. The Grenada Revolution on March 13, 1979, marked the most decisive fracture in the Anglophone Caribbean with the political and constitutional status quo. The greatest tragedy of that historical episode is that we have failed to learn the lessons of that experience, and even more disturbingly, succeeding generations seem to have no knowledge of what is, without question, the most significant historical episode in the Caribbean in the 20th century. And I'm saying, as I said back then when we were renaming the airport, the Maurice Bishop International Airport, that we need to have these things taught in our schools at every level in the Caribbean. We are making a mistake by believing that our children should not know these historical facts. It has been repeatedly said that, and I quote, "The price of freedom is eternal vigilance," end of quote. The most important lesson for us, the contemporary leaders of the region, is the imperative and the special responsibility to speak out clearly and indeed loudly against any infringement of the fundamental freedoms that our foreparents so desperately fought for. Please note that no decisive interventions were made by the Caribbean or American leadership when Eric Gary brought Grenada into the orbit of fascism with links to Pinochet and Pak Chung-hee, his use of the Mongoose Gang, and his progressive subversion of the democratic process in Grenada. In a recent lecture in honor of George Brizan, the current Director General of the OECS and a protagonist of the Grenada Revolution, Dr. Didicus Jules warned, and I quote, "Regardless of one's ideological or political outlook, it is indisputable that Grenada has a unique contemporary history, and we must learn to digest the pain as well as the accomplishments of that history, if we are to create a future brighter than the tumultuous past, end of quote. So comrades, friends, let us analyze the lessons learned with respect to the foreign policy and development options pursued by the Grenada Revolution. For me, the fundamental principles that guided the foreign policy of the revolution were: 1, an explicit policy of non-alignment and diversification of relations. Basically, the use of foreign policy to extend the range of friendships while providing options in pursuit of national self-interest. Grenada did not believe in putting all its eggs in one basket, especially a basket that was lined with dictated conditionalities that ran counter to its philosophy of what must be done to empower and enfranchise its people. To use the words of the national hero of Barbados, the Right Excellent Errol Barrow, in his first address to the United Nations as Prime Minister of Barbados, we must pursue a foreign policy that allows our countries, and I quote, to be friends of all, but satellites of none, end of quote. Number 2, the establishment of non-negotiable principles as the foundation of our foreign policy. At the core of this must be support of self-determination for all peoples. In CARICOM, this fundamental principle has guided our relations with Cuba and Venezuela, and indeed our response to the USA intervention in both Iraq and Libya. In addition, we must maintain unflinching opposition to apartheid, colonialism, and racism wherever and however they are practiced. These values flow logically from the historical journey of the majority of our people over the last 400 years in the Caribbean. Number 3, alignment of development aid requirements with foreign relations. Given the limited options we have for the development of our people, especially in the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, we must seek development aid from our friends who share a similar philosophical and developmental outlook to our countries. The 4th principle, the integration of foreign relations with solidarity groups supportive of development and the political agenda of the revolution. It is critical that we better and more strategically structure our outreach to the diaspora. This strategy pursued by the Grenadian Revolution was essential to the revolutionary government being able to beat back the efforts of the USA to derail the construction of the international airport. Today, we must seize the rhetoric as to how we can mobilize our citizens to be an effective lobby in the diaspora to advance our approach to development. We must simply get on with it as leaders and people of the region. This will be even more meaningful if we coordinate our efforts as a region to sensitize and mobilize our people, whether in London, New York, or Toronto. We should note that besides extending its relations with traditional Western powers such as the United Kingdom, the European Union, and France, and seeking to extend relations with the United States, Grenada built up close relations with a wide cluster of non-traditional countries, the Nordic countries, a diverse array of democratic Latin American states, for example, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the Soviet Union, Vietnam, East Germany, the Democratic Republic of Korea, Mozambique, Libya, and Syria. Hugh O'Shaughnessy, in his book, I quote, Grenada Revolution, Invasion, and Aftermath, end of quote, recounted that Washington's rage reached paranoid proportions when Grenada started close cooperation with Cuba and the USSR. Grenada's action challenged the hegemony that Washington was expecting to extend throughout the Caribbean after the withdrawal of the British, who had dominated it for 2 centuries. Grenada's foreign policy under Maurice Bishop is best summed up in his extensive quotation from an early speech in response to a US ultimatum on relations with Cuba. I quote, Grenada is a sovereign and independent country, although a tiny speck on the world map, and we expect all countries to strictly respect our independence, just as we will respect theirs. No country has the right to tell us what to do or how to run our country or who to be friendly with. We certainly would not attempt to tell any other country what to do. We are not in anybody's backyard, and we are definitely not for sale. Anybody who thinks they can bully us or threaten us clearly has no understanding, idea, or clue as to what material we are made of. They clearly have no idea of the tremendous struggles which our people have fought. Though small and poor, we are proud and determined. We would sooner give up our lives before we compromise, sell out, or betray our sovereignty, our independence, our integrity, our manhood, and the right of our people to national self-determination and social progress. He goes on to say, we are a small country, we're a poor country, with a population of largely African descent. We are part of the exploited third world, and we definitely have a stake in seeking the creation of a new international economic order, which would assist in ensuring economic justice for the oppressed and exploited peoples of the world, and in ensuring that the resources of the sea are used for the benefit of all the people of the world and not for a tiny minority of profiteers. Our aim, therefore, is to join all organizations and work with all countries that will help us to become more independent and more in control of our own resources. In this regard, nobody who understands present-day realities can seriously challenge our right to develop working relations with a variety of countries, end of quote. Does that sound familiar, ladies and gentlemen? The construction of the international airport is the best example of the materialization of the benefits of revolutionary Grenada's foreign policy alignment with its development option. The airport was built with funding from the most diverse assortment of countries: Cuba, Canada, the Caribbean Development Bank, France, Venezuela, and Libya were among the main contributors. Contrary to the assertions by US President Reagan, the airport was a major economic and not a military project, as the US wanted us to believe. It was designed to transform Grenada's tourism and trade potential, and was one of the most widely supported initiatives of the revolution. It significantly opened up the economic options of Grenadians, and by extension, their social well-being. I must confess that I have drawn heavily on many of these principles in piloting my country through one of the most devastating recessions in recent history. When the Dominican Labour Party came into power in 2000, it found a foreign policy that was determined by traditional colonial customs. The 44 countries with which we had established diplomatic relations since independence were predominantly on the American side of the Cold War divide. And you can understand why Ms. Charles was opposed to the revolution. So. As the Cold War thawed out, my administration decided to review the country's foreign policy. We rationally decided that it was in the best interest of Dominica to shift from supporting Taiwan to adopting the One China policy. This change of policy began to bear fruit immediately, as support in the form of grants and concessionary loans was received from the People's Republic of China. These were used for building the Windsor Park Sports Stadium, rehabilitating the Roosevelt Portsmouth Road, improving the housing stock in Dominica, getting access to ongoing agricultural technical cooperation, upgrading of the medical facilities, disbursing flood relief funds, offering scholarships to students, constructing the State House, the Conference Center, the Commission Building, and the new Dominica State College, just to name a few of the projects and programs we have received from the PRC. Similar close relations were established with the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela that led to the signing of the Petro-Caribe Agreement and the joining of the Bolivarian Alliance for Peoples of our Americas, ALBA, in 2008. The benefits that flowed from these agreements included access to low-priced petroleum products, grants and concessionary funding to finance our housing revolution, grants for hurricane recovery, the National Security Program, the construction of many sea defense walls, agricultural diversification, tourism infrastructure, scholarships, and the Melville Airport upgrade. Realignment with other countries brought several more benefits, such as healthcare and scholarships from Cuba, and investments from the Kingdom of Morocco for the construction of a hotel in Dominica. By 2014, Dominica had established meaningful and productive relationships with more than 94 states. In the process, it received international recognition for its efforts to eradicate poverty and achieve sustainable development without destroying its natural environment and its communities. In this way, Dominica was able to attract more grants, concessionary loans, and technical aid from friendly countries. Today, all countries, particularly small island developing states, face the challenges of globalization. As the Right Honourable P.J. Patterson warned us, and I quote, "None of us should believe that autonomy and independence constitute irreversible and unassailable gains for relatively small and powerless nations. The shadow of globalization is as long as its grip is strong, and it carries with it the potential, if not the intention by the powerful, to make client states of the weak and vulnerable, opening them as markets, assuming once again control of their factors of production, and reducing them to a state of dependency that compromises their autonomy, end of quote. Similarly, George Brizan, the Grenadian economist, has reminded us to be constantly vigilant of the new threats to small and vulnerable jurisdictions in the region. He said, and I quote, "Today, the new imperialism that is emerging has many faces, very different in form to the old, well-known faces. But the elaborate system of control and dominance of the world economy by a few nations remains intact, despite accommodation for a few new ones. The ending of the Cold War has enhanced and strengthened that control, dominance, and stranglehold of the few on the many, by the minority of countries on the majority of countries," end of quote. In the final analysis, globalization poses both opportunities and threats. We have dwelt long enough on the challenges at the expense of the opportunities. So let us not despair and overlook the opportunities. As Maurice Bishop constantly reminded his comrades, I quote, "Revolutionaries do not have the right to be cowards. We have to stand up to fight for our country because the country is ours. It does not belong to anybody else," end of quote. I am convinced that the Caribbean is still on a trajectory to realizing the dreams of our ancestors and those who fought for our right to self-determination and independence. During slavery and colonialism, our forefathers faced the daily trauma of dehumanizing conditions as they chipped away at the monumental obstacles to their progress. In more recent decades, success came in the form of political independence. With that milestone, we could say that we had truly come a long way. However, inspired by the seminal work of the great Nobel laureate Amartya Sen in his Freedom is Choice, our generation of Caribbean people understand that it is only when our citizens can make choices as they go about their daily lives that they will be truly free and independent. This must remain our mission as we seek to reverse 4 centuries of utter exploitation. I believe that the current recession has taught many of us the virtue of uniting, the imperative of diversifying our economies by encouraging entrepreneurship and putting our God-given resources to optimum use, and the need to remain steadfast in our mission to generate wealth in such a way that all of our people receive a fair share. We have to first create the wealth, then distribute it more equitably among our citizens so that their lot does not mirror that of their grandparents and great-grandparents. Let us be frank, my dear friends. Our small size has not traditionally given us a competitive advantage. However, we now have the opportunity to leverage the technological advances in transport and communication, along with the political structures of the Economic Union of the OECS and the single market of CARICOM to better deliver the promises of development to all our people. In a very real sense, the establishment of these two regional entities as communities of sovereign states is the ultimate testimony of how foreign policy may be a clear expression of faith in what can be achieved while maintaining our independence as nation-states in this region. These treaties, which have signed in the name of our people, must be made living instruments that will make a difference to the teenager now leaving school in St. George's who wants to work in the international business sector, or the dressmaker in Roseau who really wants to go into fashion and costume designing, or the farmer in St. Vincent and the Grenadins who must find additional markets for his produce to be able to continue to live fully off the land without worrying that the local market is too small to support his family, or the fisherman in the Southern Caribbean who still does not understand how we can have a University of the West Indies and a West Indies cricket team, but he cannot sail the Caribbean Sea without fear of losing his liberty. I focus on these people-centered issues, for I have the responsibility in CARICOM for the movement of Caribbean people. And just as Maurice Bishop and the People's Revolutionary Government understood that the philosophy to develop Grenadians had to be at the center of their foreign policy, we as leaders of this great Caribbean civilization must ensure that in the most sincere expression of our foreign policy, namely in our regional treaty arrangements, that we keep the needs of our people at the center of the integration movement. It is not an academic exercise. It is and must always be about our people and their right to have choices, to taste and enjoy freedom in all of its dimensions. Equally, we have a responsibility to ensure that we preserve our environment as guardians for the benefit of our children and grandchildren. The risks that we face as a result of global warming threaten to affect our very existence. This is real, my dear friends. But our responses as nation-states have not been sufficiently proactive. How many of our countries are devoting sufficient resources to minimize the consequences of natural disasters that are more likely to affect us as the global climate warms? Where in our foreign policy are we developing those international relationships with countries that have already had to start confronting these issues long before our region? Where are our voices in the international arena? In concluding, my dear friends and comrades, the most important lesson we have learned from the Grenada Revolution is that in the final analysis, it is the philosophy, together with the conviction, commitment, and passion of leaders, which make the ultimate difference. At this crucial turning point in the history of the Caribbean, we need many such leaders. We do need many such leaders. Let us therefore commit ourselves to internalizing the lessons of the Grenada Revolution. Let us do so here in Grenada, where the stranglehold of rampant exploitation and subjugation of our people was loosened on March 13, 1979, and where the demise of the Cold War began in 1983. Let us be inspired by the example of those who gave their lives in pursuit of the beliefs and the ideals. Let us pledge to make the promise of true freedom and independence a reality for our Caribbean citizens. May God bless Grenada. May God bless the Caribbean. I thank you very much.